Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we'll see the first American long-range ground-launched cruise missile test in decades, look at how the U.S. Army will fight in the future, and discuss what the Navy's Maritime Logistics Force needs to do to modernize. With in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis. This is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin. Before we begin, this week marks my 100th episode of the show, so thanks for watching week after week. This week is filled with some major news, so let's dive in. The Pentagon has moved from pausing a major missile defense program to outright killing it, as Undersecretary of Defense Mike Griffin has pulled the plug on Boeing's redesigned kill vehicle effort, which is being worked on by Raytheon. That kill vehicle was to replace the current Enhanced Kill Vehicle, or EKV, on ground-based interceptors in the ground-based mid-course defense system, but now the Pentagon is looking to design and build a next generation of interceptors with a new kill vehicle to replace current GBIs. The Pentagon is now working through exactly what they want that next-gen program to look like. And for the first time since the end of the INF Treaty, the United States has conducted a flight test of a ground-launched cruise missile with a range of more than 500 kilometers, signifying the true end of that arms control agreement. The missile tested was a variant of the Tomahawk missile fired from a modified Mark 41 vertical launch system. According to the DoD announcement of the test, the missile hit its target after being fired from San Nicolas Island off California, and that the results will be used in future development of intermediate-range missiles. And Japan has made it official, selecting the F-35B as the Asian nation's short takeoff and vertical landing fighter of the future. What has long been assumed that the F-35B would be Japan's choice, the statement from the Ministry of Defense confirmed those rumors. 42 of the aircraft will be purchased and are likely to embark on Japan's Izumo-class helicopter destroyers, allowing them to effectively operate as light aircraft carriers, Japan's first since World War II. And just over 30 years ago, the B-2 stealth bomber flew for the first time, introducing the world to its unique shape. And while there are many modernization efforts being worked on for the B-2, its successor, the B-21, is looming large. While no public details have been released on the bomber, its first flight is believed to be set for sometime next year, and contractor Northrop Grumman says that technology from the B-2 has made its way into the radar. In addition, the Air Force is also working to figure out just how many of those next-generation bombers they'll end up buying. And the United States Navy has a new leader, as Admiral Mike Gilday has taken over from Admiral John Richardson, whose tenure was marked by both steps forward and back for the Navy. Gilday was named CNO after the previous nominee, Admiral Bill Moran, suddenly retired last month. He was previously the director of the Joint Staff and had this message for sailors upon taking the helm of the Sea Service.
Coming from an assignment in the Joint Staff, I've spent the past weeks getting reblued back into the United States Navy. In 2 words, it has been both uplifting and exciting. I do believe that our Navy's strategic direction is rock solid, and I think our Navy's in great shape. We are recruiting and retaining a high-quality force. We are providing well-trained combat forces forward around the globe. We are modernizing our Navy at a scope and a pace that we have not seen in decades.
One big challenge Gilday is going to have to face as CNO is that despite billions being pumped into the defense budget in recent years, the U.S. Navy is still short hundreds of millions of dollars in ship maintenance funds and is looking at an almost $1 billion shortfall in 2020. That lack of funds means that the service could lose progress on improving readiness and clearing a massive maintenance backlog. But there's also a much larger problem, and that the Navy may not even be able to move the money to fix this problem because of other moves for things like housing, deployments to the border, and hurricane relief. That means the Navy is set to be faced with some tough choices in the near future. And the U.S. State Department has officially cleared the sale of 66 of the newest model of the F-16, known as the F-16V, to Taiwan in a move that has infuriated China. The sale, potentially worth up to $8 billion, includes the Block 70 versions of the F-16s, along with engines, avionics, and other equipment. The deal has long been in limbo and still has to be approved by Congress, but if it's approved, it's a much-needed boost both to Lockheed Martin's F-16 production line and to Taiwan's Air Force. And the new U.S. Space Command has a liftoff date, set for August 29th. The new organization, set to be led by Air Force General John Raymond, will inherit 87 different units and will be the U.S. military's lead warfighting command for space. It's the first new combatant command since the United States Africa Command was created in 2009 and is the first true step to establishing a new Space Force sometime in the near future. And the stand-up of that space command was announced at this week's National Space Council meeting held at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia. Here are some highlights from that event.
There have been debates about how the NRO and military space organizations could be better integrated. Early in this task, we recognized that the proposed establishment of U.S. Space Command provides us with the opportunity to finally determine the appropriate level of integration between the intelligence community and DoD to ensure effective space operations. I'm pleased to tell you that after months of analysis and deliberations, the intelligence community and the Department of Defense have agreed to align U.S. Space Command and the NRO into a new unified defense concept of operations at the National Space Defense Center. As part of U.S. Space Command, the National Space Defense Center is a joint DoD intelligence community organization and will become the center of gravity for defending our vital interest in space.
A key component to this effort is reforming Title 10 of the United States Code. This will provide the necessary legal authority for the Space Force to organize, train, and equip ready forces for our warfighting combatant commanders. Without modification to Title 10, the current legislative provisions do not provide all the necessary authorities to establish a separate service in the 6th branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. The Department is fully engaged with the Defense Authorizing Committees to ensure that the final NDAA language explicitly includes the United States Space Force as an armed force with the necessary authorities in Title 10, and thereby codifying it alongside its sister services in this bedrock law. While this new service will reside within the Department of the Air Force, it does not mean that it is solely an Air Force effort. Each service has its own cadre of space experts with a keen sense of how space affects their unique domains, and they should be given the opportunity to contribute to this important event in our history. To be truly effective, the United States Space Force must integrate with the larger national security space effort and collaborate across the whole of government, as Director McGuire mentioned.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. And when we come back, we'll look at how the Army will fight in the future. A major change in doctrine for the U.S. Army doesn't happen a lot, or even overnight. To get an understanding of where things are right now, Jen Judson headed down to Fort Eustis, Virginia, to chat with Lieutenant General Eric Wesley, head of the Army's Futures and Concepts Center. Here's what he had to say.
All right, wondering if you can discuss multi-domain operations task force and how that is further developing the multi-domain operations as a concept as you move into doctrine.
Right. Yes, Jenna. Well, multi-domain task force is what we call it, or the MDTF. MDTF is a great description of experimentation and piloting programs to learn. A few years ago, the Chief of Staff of the Army, then General Milley, directed us to do a pilot called Multi-Domain Task Force. And the whole purpose of this pilot was to learn how to best integrate all the domains, space, cyber, maritime, air, ground. And the reason this is important is because you can imagine these domains, all controlled at different echelons by different services, can get very complex. A number of people would say, well, we've been integrating domains for some time, right? But the key thing in the future is we need to be able to integrate these domains rapidly and continually through large-scale ground combat. And that requires a synchronization at a level that is going to require artificial intelligence, et cetera. So MDTF is a means to pilot the program to learn how to do that best. The second thing I would point is we want to get a capability out on the ground that COCOM commanders can touch and feel, something tangible. And this effort has enabled us to do that in fairly rapid order. We see it as a bridge. We don't think that's the end, because ultimately we want to transcend the ability to integrate all domains across all echelons, across a theater. So this will be a bridge to multi-domain operations in the future.
Okay, so how does the concept tie into what you're doing with the other services? How are you working jointness into this, since you do have to all operate together in this?
Well, and your last question relates directly to this one. You can very quickly perceive and realize that you can't really have multi-domain operations if the whole joint force doesn't agree as to how that plays out and how they integrate. So a good example is the Air Force right now. We're working very closely with the Air Force. In fact, the former Vice Chairman, General Silva, directed a very rapid effort to solve the multi-domain command and control problem. You know, how do you do that when all services control these domains and they move at different tempos? And so the Air Force is leading an effort where they're enabling all the services to come together to solve the problem of multi-domain command and control, probably the #1 challenge for the joint force. The other thing I would note is the COCOM commanders. If you look at the Indo-PACOM commander right now is really looking to see how do we leverage the ground force to enable the Navy. We oftentimes don't think about Indo-PACOM in terms of a ground combat environment, but you have 20,000 some islands in the Indo-PACOM AOR, and if you imagine it like this, imagine the Army being able to assist the Navy in controlling some sea lanes from the ground. Now, I would never presume to say that the Army is fundamental to that, but we, part of the joint force, would be a part of that.
Okay. Can you elaborate on some of the experimentation that you have going on that will feed into your development of the doctrine, war games you have coming up, and what are some of the goals in terms of ironing this all out?
Yeah, well, the first one I would mention is the one we just talked about. The Multi-Domain Task Force is a form of prototyping or experimentation which directly fed into the current document that was signed by General Milley, Multi-Domain Operations in 2028. That was informed by the MDTF work that we did. But this is ongoing efforts. So we just finished in May our capstone war game where we fought a theater level campaign using multi-domain operations in the Indo-PACOM AOR. The Joint Staff is directing the globally integrated war game, which is coming up this fall. And all the services will work together, integrating their concepts in a manner to see how we optimize the way the different services are looking at this problem, lessons learned from across the services.
Okay, and I know you obviously one of the multi-domain task force has been in the Pacific for several years now. Can you talk a little bit about how the task force that is being stood up in Europe may differ from that, and what is going to be the same?
Well, I think that the key thing here is that what you're looking at, the fundamental difference is the terrain, right? Europe, the European AOR is much smaller than the Indo-PACOM. The European AOR is largely land-based, whereas in Indo-PACOM, obviously, it's mostly sea-based. So what we have to do is optimize the capabilities in Europe, and so that you'll have a lot more agility in moving the multi-domain task force, as an example, because it's a ground-based platform. So I think that we'll see us make some adjustments and learn from the lessons we learned in Europe, but only those lessons that are relevant to a ground campaign.
And you've talked about the fact that formations are likely going to have to change, and that you've been looking and experimenting and wargaming, all this. Is there anything that's coming to light in terms of how formations change that you know will definitely be changing? Is there anything that you can discuss now about how you might see changes to the formation?
The first thing I would tell you is like as I alluded to a moment ago, is we will have to build out our capabilities above brigade. When we were a single dominant superpower in the 90s and the early 2000s, we could afford to fight BCT-centric because there was nothing that could stop our brigade combat teams in that period. But now that our adversaries have invested in long-range precision fires, that they've developed their anti-access area denial capabilities, they've pushed their standoff capabilities at a greater distance. What you find is that a BCT can't handle all problems. And so particularly the long-range precision fires, the air defense problems, have to be solved at echelons above the brigade combat team commander. So you'll see us build out the Army at echelon.
Okay.
Coming up, we'll look at how the Navy's Maritime Logistics Force needs to be modernized for future war. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Brian Parker offers his latest tips.
You've worked hard to build your business, and when you think a few years out, you see a bright future. But getting there takes careful planning. That's why a business succession plan is critical. It helps chart the course for what comes next. Are you planning to retire soon or sell your business to a partner, employee, or family member? Your decision may depend on whether you've chosen someone who has industry experience and is business savvy. This person should be trained on the day-to-day workings of the company so that they can easily take over from day one. It's also important to set milestones for accomplishing your plan and be financially ready for the next phase of your life. Many lenders, like Navy Federal, offer a range of business services to help you manage your company now and grow your business in the years ahead. Planning for succession from the start is not only practical, but also in the best interest of your company. With a well-designed plan, you can sail into the future knowing your business will thrive for the long term.
Thanks, Brian. We'll see you next time. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our Early Bird Brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And coming up, we'll look at how the Navy's Maritime Logistics Force needs to be modernized for future conflict. Well, there's a big focus on the ships that the U.S. Navy would use to fight in a future war. There's not always a focus on the logistic ships that support them. To learn more about what's needed, I got the chance to chat with a couple of experts from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Here's that interview. All right, gents, thanks for taking the time to chat with me about this report. I enjoyed reading it, and a lot of work that obviously went into it. So kind of walk me through, what was the inadequacy you guys found in current forces for maritime logistics?
Perfect. Thank you very much for having us, Jeff. Harrison and I, as well as our co-author Ryan Boone, found that the current and programmed maritime logistics force is inadequate to support U.S. defense strategy, especially against China and Russia, for two main reasons. The first is that the Navy's at-sea logistics force is too vulnerable and also lacks the capability and capacity necessary to support distributed operations. And then the second primary reason is that the nation's strategic sea lift force, which are the government and commercial ships that carry vehicles, equipment, and supplies to forces ashore, is rapidly aging out, faces a number of readiness issues, and also doesn't have enough mariners to actually man those fleets. So those were the two primary challenges that are inhibiting the fleet today.
And so with those challenges, those aren't obviously challenges that suddenly popped up overnight. They've been there, they've kind of been slowly building. Was that something that you guys found?
So part of how we got to where we are today is that the logistics enterprise writ large has been optimized for efficiency and economy. And that is a very good strategy, and it works when you're fighting the war on terror, as we have been for almost the past 20 years. What we're saying in this report is that the fundamental tenets of this have changed, and that instead of being designed for economic efficiency, the logistics enterprise writ large needs to also be designed for resiliency. Resiliency and economic efficiency are, in some senses, opposed. And so we are suggesting building a logistics infrastructure and establishment that is able to accept and absorb risk.
So when we look at the challenges that are going to be there for this logistics force with a possible great power conflict, what's the differences between the current logistics force in the war on terror? Is there a main difference between what it is now for the war on terror versus what it has to be for a great power conflict? Is it more ships are directly needed? Is more capabilities on those ships? What do you guys see?
It's a holistic change. In our report, we have 4 different ways that the logistics fleet should change. Some of them are actually to stay with the large oilers, which constitute the backbone of the logistics fleet today, but also to go small, go fast, and go different with other types of ships being introduced. I think the major change is actually a mindset and the way that they're operated. And it's the ability to accept and absorb risk is the fundamental thing that needs to change.
Yep, to build on Harrison's remarks, I think the ways the fleet needs to shift is that we found that we probably need to have a fleet that's larger, more differentiated in terms of having different types of logistics vessels. But if we follow some innovative approaches, it could actually be a fleet that's relatively cost efficient to be able to field. And so as Harrison was mentioning, one of the areas we found in terms of at-sea fleet logistics, we focused on refueling. And so we recommended that the fleet shift from a fleet that's relatively uniform with these 15 oilers and 2 fast combat support ships to a more mixed fleet where it would have a larger number of consolidated logistics tankers, what we call going big. It would have new light oilers based off of offshore support vessel designs, which we call going small. It would go fast by accelerating the TAO 205 John Lewis class oiler construction rate from around 1 per year to a sustained 2 per year construction rate. And then finally, it would go different by introducing fuel bladders and barges as unmanned or attritable refueling assets that could operate in highly contested areas. The good news is that we assessed that this more mixed refueling architecture would not only be more operationally resilient, but it would also be $7 to $8 billion less expensive than an all-oiler force that similarly met peacetime and wartime demands. So it makes sense from both operational reasons, but budgetary ones to shift to this new fleet.
And this is kind of the logistics forces, both in every navy, are kind of the soft underbelly of any navy. They're an easy. They're necessarily an easy target that can really inhibit the way that's fought. So looking at that contested environment, looking at that beyond what else is needed? What is needed by the Navy? What would your report find? What is the major shift that has to be made here in order to really change that logistics force?
So we found we need to focus more on that resilience, and we had a number of recommendations in terms of refueling, in terms of transferring cargo and munitions. A key area in terms of transferring munitions is developing a new way to reload the vertical launch system cells, which are the primary magazines on surface combatants. Right now, they could only be reloaded ashore, and we recommend the introduction of an at-sea reloading capability that would transform the Navy's ability to reload its missiles from a few fixed locations to many mobile ones.
And when I started to look at this topic, that was one thing I was shocked at. A couple years ago when I first learned that you couldn't do a VLS reload at sea or something like that. That's a game changer. What type of technology would be needed for it?
So it's technology that ONR and others have been working on very hard for a long time. These missiles are large and they're heavy, and if you can imagine, if you ever played that game Operation when you were a kid, it's very similar to that. They don't respond well to being pranged or bumping the sides of the tubes as they're being reloaded. However, writ large, not beyond this report, but in other work that we've done here at CSBA, when people come to us and want to talk to us about what the size of the force should be, we're always concerned about how they're going to be resupplied, where they're going to be resupplied from, and where those munitions are going to come from. Talking about VLS reload at sea implicitly implies that you have a large reserve of missiles to do the reloading with.
Because instead of being able to have a relatively small supply that are kept at those few fixed locations, you now have to have enough, the same amount that were at those fixed locations, at many more as you're overseas with that. Now that's fascinating. It's something that the Navy needs. So, but looking at all of what you guys say is needed for the logistics force, can it happen? Is it feasible in budget environments with the way people are looking at, with the way the Navy is looking, with the new CNO coming in and everything? Do you think it's feasible and that it might happen?
Sure. I think in terms of the cost, feasibility, and then we can maybe address sort of political practicalities and embrace of that. In terms of cost, we assessed that in order to field a more resilient maritime logistics force in which DoD cooperates more effectively with the Maritime Administration and with the commercial merchant marine, it would come out to around 6% more than what the U.S. government's currently planning to spend in this area. That's about $1.6 billion more per year. And it could be achieved in about 15 years in terms of the transition from the current fleet to the future one. It's a significant amount of funding, but we think it's reasonable and achievable, as we're talking about $1.6 billion per year. These funds could come from either additional total resources or by reallocating a portion of currently planned combatant resources to logistics in order to create a more balanced fleet that can help those combatants stay forward and stay fighting. As we looked at possibilities over the 30-year shipbuilding plan, this would require maybe cuts to around 6 combatants and a couple other changes over the 30 years, which is a reasonable shift. And so as we look at the budgets, investing more funding into logistics makes sense regardless of whether the budget's going up, going down, or staying flat.
Okay.
And to tie on there, yes, logistics investments, particularly both within and without the Navy, have the unique attribute that if we do enter into great power conflict, we'll be very happy that we did this. If we have an era of continued peace and prosperity, we will still be very happy that we did it. So it's a good course of action. The reaction to our report overall, since we've released it and been briefing it around, has been positive because we've been telling people in the Navy that the Navy should have more ships. The real fight And the real hard part is when the establishment writ large begins to sit down and figure out where the money is going to come from and who is going to actually have to give something up in order to make these additional logistics ships happen.
And that argument in military, since the dawn of time, hasn't exactly been easy to make an argument for non-combat what are sometimes deemed non-combat resources, first combat resources. Even though you and we all know that without logistics, you don't have combat. So
the good news, though, I think, is that as you look at, for instance, this year's National Defense Authorization Act bill, there's language calling for DoD to focus more on logistics. There's language calling for a redo of the mobility capabilities requirement study that Transcom did. There's language calling for a new tanker security program. So I think lawmakers on Capitol Hill are recognizing that what's traditionally been a U.S. strength, logistics, now risks becoming a major weakness that could actually cause the U.S. to lose a war, especially against China. Additionally, I think it's also good news that there's a new incoming Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gilday, and he'll have an opportunity to take a look at some of these gaps and possibly pursue a fleet that's more balanced and could help have a more resilient logistics fleet that can enhance lethality as well.
That's all we have time for this week, but if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.